Today is June 6th, 2024. 80 years ago, the world was on fire. Monstrous tyrants claiming godlike powers for themselves were attempting to crush humanity under their boot heels. To quote George Orwell, the future looked like a boot heel trampling on a human face. On this day, 80 years ago, 44,000 men on a beach in northwestern France tried to stop it, and 1 in 4 of them never made it off the beach. But the rest of them did, and they stopped one of these tyrants, one of these blasphemous god emperors who were attempting to destroy mankind, God's image off the face of the earth. On the other side of the world, in a small desert village that was kept off any maps, a much smaller group of mostly men and some women were working on another plan. Many of them were Jews. Many of them had lost loved ones and families to the tyrant across the sea, and they wanted to strike back, to defeat the evil that threatened the globe by building a bomb. And a little over a year later, on July 16th, 1945, they succeeded. Their weapon worked. They named the place where they tested it out Trinity, the three-persons God. By that time, Adolf Hitler had already put a bullet in his own head, and the German Reich had already been defeated. And it was discovered that Nazi efforts to construct their own nuclear weapon, under the direction of Werner Heisenberg, had failed hopelessly, barely even getting off the ground. Many suspected that this was deliberate on Heisenberg's part, or maybe Hitler failed to see the significance of Jewish science to his war plans and never gave Heisenberg the resources he needed. Historians debate this point even now. The weapon, the gadget, was used on another god emperor who, unlike Hitler, refused to surrender even if that meant the complete destruction of himself and his people. Hirohito also seemed to have a death wish, and so the United States turned the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki into apocalyptic lakes of fire. This effectively ended World War II, but it was the beginning of another war that is still being fought now. There are still tyrants out there, and as Friedrich Nietzsche once warned, those who would hunt monsters should look to see that they themselves do not become one. This is all history, facts. In the fictional universe of Terminator, sometime in the near future, humanity gave up responsibility for our collective nuclear arsenal to a godlike tyrant thinking machine, an artificial intelligence, AI, called Skynet. And Skynet uses that nuclear arsenal to destroy most of mankind. So who is responsible? The machine, or the humans who built the machine? And the other humans who didn't stop them? This episode is about responsibility. I'm Calvin Seiler.
And this is Ian.
Come with us if you want to live.
All right. So we are talking about episode 3 of season 1 of Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicles. This episode is titled The Turk, and it introduces one of the most important plot threads for the rest of the series. I was just talking to Calvin before we started that so much of this series lays bricks, and instead of just small pieces, it seems like almost every episode of this first season has a huge piece that becomes even more important next season.
Yeah. Yeah, this is, we were just talking about it before we started recording. In my mind, this is just a ridiculously well-written episode. It, like you said, just builds so many different layers in the dialogue and the visuals and the way that it reinforces different themes with those visuals. So, yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah, this episode was written by John Worth and directed by Paul Edwards and aired January 21st, 2008. So over just about 16 and a half years ago now. Before we get too far, I do want to mention, if you are listening in June or July of 2024, there is another Terminator television show coming out at the end of July called Terminator Zero. It is animated, set in Japan, and coming out on Netflix. So Calvin and I will do our best to watch that show when it comes out, and we'll decide how we cover it depending on how we feel about it. But we are
I
aware of
predict
it.
it sucks because most things do.
Calvin does think it's going to suck. I think it has a very high likelihood of sucking because even though I like a lot of the Terminator films and books that people think are bad, they're not great, that's for sure. Very few of them are Terminator the Sarah Connor Chronicles level of complexity, challenging, and satisfying.
All right, let's get into this episode. So the episode doesn't start with it's sort of a cold open. It's more, the way I thought of it is more of a thesis statement. So
Well, it's a cold
Sarah
open.
Connor is Sarah
It's a
Connor
cold open. It's a cold open similar to the pilot in that it's a dream.
It is. It's a dream that she had while she was in the mental asylum that she breaks out of in T2 Judgment Day. And so she's talking about how she has become obsessed with nuclear scientists. We see her in a room somewhere in Los Alamos with the scientists who developed the U.S. nuclear bomb project, the Manhattan Project. And in the dream, the scientists, she kills the scientists, but they come back to life as Terminators and destroy her. And the line that she says is, "I wanted to understand them, these fathers of our destruction."
So my biggest question is, why did Warner Brothers delay the release of Barbenheimer so long when they could have reaped the tie-in rewards with the Sarah Connor Chronicles television show in 2008?
My guess, I haven't researched this. My guess is that the movie Oppenheimer was a twinkling in Christopher Nolan's eye in 2008.
Well, in 2008, he was, releasing The Dark Knight.
Right. And my guess is that Greta Gerwig and the other writers of the Barbie movie had not even thought about.
Was it 2008 when she made Damsels in Distress?
Yeah, what was Greta Gerwig doing in 2008? Making a much better movie than Barbie.
Well, okay. To be fair, I have not seen Barbie. I don't want to see Barbie, not because I think it's bad, but because I think I won't like it. But I really like Damsels in Distress, and people should watch it. It's a really good movie. And she is good in it.
If anybody in Hollywood or at Warner Brothers is listening right now, whatever movie you're planning on making this year, just take that money, cancel that movie, take that money, and give it to Whit Stillman, and he'll make gold. Like the movie itself probably won't make any money, but it will be a good movie. So,
well, and if you only give Whit Stillman like $10 million and then use the rest of the money that you would have given to the movie for marketing, it might actually make money.
Who knows? All I'm saying, Whit Stillman has never made a bad movie.
So I do think that having watched Oppenheimer, this scene has even more resonance because you see those characters and you can answer the question of what they were thinking. You can answer Sarah Connor's question. I also think, and this is kind of a technical experiential thing, when I first watched this on the Fox website, early streaming service, Fox website, college dorm in Tennessee, this scene looked like garbage. The Terminators looked awful. And I think that because I'm now watching it on Blu-ray, there's something about the effects integrating with the film quality that works in high definition that absolutely did not work on low quality streaming of 2008. Because I remember this episode specifically just looking awful when the Terminators were on screen, because there's two big Terminator scenes, and I hated both of them. But when I rewatched it, I was like, this actually looks pretty good. It looks pretty cool. I understand they're limiting the number of shots and limiting poses because it's TV budget, but they put enough money into the rendering and the movement, and it looks scary and cool.
That's this is a technical question, which is more your domain than mine. Yeah, I mean, I watched it streaming off of Prime Video. I mean, the Terminators do look slightly CGI-y, but not in a way that I found distracting or off-putting.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely can tell they're CGI, but given that I actually don't like the stop motion Terminator in Terminator 1, I am not complaining. I just think that the rendering looks good in high definition where it really looks bad when it's on a standard or lower definition.
So like I said, I originally watched this television show on
TV.
On TV, on broadcast television. And I remember the scene because I thought it was a very visually arresting scene of her killing the Los Alamos scientists and then them slowly coming back to life and then transforming into T-100s.
That's a confusing question about T-100s versus T-800s.
Or Terminators.
Well, there's more than one Terminator.
Evil robots with glowing red metal eyes.
Yes.
Like we discussed in the first episode.
So we move from the dream to John starting school. And here's a whole plot line. As I like the impacts of this episode's school plot line a lot more than the plot line itself. So watching the commentaries, Thomas Dekker said that they had to cut out a lot of stuff, and they clearly had a whole plan for the second half of the season that, of course, wasn't produced because of the writer's strike, where they explored this teacher's affair with a student in depth, and obviously John would have a big plot part of that. But I frankly find most of that really dumb and kind of clunky. I think really what's important is that John is forced to watch someone die. And then he has to deal with that.
Well, the whole I mean, maybe we should talk about this later in
Well, I should say there are going to be spoilers for this episode all the way through. I wrote it in the show notes and then I forgot to say it. Spoiler warning, we're going to spoil the whole episode. So this is an after episode discussion. This is not if you haven't watched the episode.
It's the ending scene is a shocking scene because it's not just John and Cameron who watch her die. The entire high school watches her die.
And like, I was
thinking about that while I was watching the scene. I was like, all of the students who saw this are just going to be deeply traumatized for the rest of their lives.
Well, and I think it's really interesting.
A student go splat on the parking lot pavement.
I think it's really interesting how this feels a lot like the kinds of mob culture and callousness that we often hear discussed in think pieces about social media. And this is before, Twitter and Facebook was really big. I mean, Facebook kind of existed at this point, but it wasn't nearly as big. Twitter didn't really exist. YouTube was in its infancy. So social media hadn't really taken root, I would argue. And yet this show shows people acting exactly the same way they do on Twitter when, people are bored or people hate someone or people think that they're afraid that they're going to be lumped in with the unpopular group if they don't mock someone. And it was brutal and tragic and horrifying in a good way. Like it is supposed to be horrifying, and I think we feel it well.
Yeah, I mean, I have thought about this recently. There's a creator that I like named Terry Miles, who's done a series of different fictional radio drama podcasts that are sort of in the science fiction, fantasy, horror genre. But the most recent one that I listened to is called Wildflowers. It's only available on Audible, and in some ways, even though it doesn't have any overt supernatural elements to it, it's about a high school girl who kills another high school girl out of jealousy. And it deals with kind of some of the themes that you're talking about with social media and bullying. And I'm like, in some ways, this is more terrifying than monsters jumping out of you in the woods. Just to watch this one high school girl destroy this other high school girl's life slowly. Spoilers for Wildflowers. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was about to say.
If you were planning on listening to that podcast, I just spoiled the entire plot for you. I apologize.
So
we have digressed, Ian.
Well, I want to get back to my original question. I feel that this school stuff has good impacts, but I am personally glad they ditched it in season 2. Do you wish they'd spent more time in school in season 2, or do you think, like many things that the writers have openly said, they learned every episode and adjusted what they were doing for the next episode? And I think it's clear that one of the big lessons they learned from season 1 is high school in a Terminator show is boring.
Well, so I have a theory, which I'll run by you, which is that I think the costuming choices, like I said, the visual elements of this episode are just as well written, in my opinion, as the dialogue. And I think that many of the costuming choices in this episode are significant. So my theory, and maybe we'll talk about this when it kind of comes up in the episode, but is that the character, what's her name?
The one from season 2 or this one?
The character, she isn't given. Oh, she's not given a name in this episode, I don't think. Her name is. We learn in a future episode in season 1 that her name is
Sherry Weston.
Sherry Weston. My theory is that she was going to fulfill the role that Riley plays in season 2, but because of the writer's strike and behind the scenes goofiness, that never took off. So yes, you're right. You're right in that from what I read, there was going to be this subplot involving an affair with a teacher, but I think it also was going to tie into the resistance cell that Kyle Reese is a part of.
You mean Derek?
Derek Reese, yes. Sorry.
I think that honestly would have been a little far-fetched. I don't know. As I've said, I think they did manage some good elements, particularly the ending of this episode, but I think they made the right choice in minimizing all that quite a bit.
All right, so after John goes off to school, Sarah goes off to find Mrs. Dyson. I forget, what's Dyson's wife's first name again?
Teresa
Dyson. Which it's a great scene. It has a great line, which I think is significant. Teresa, I think, is the first character to explicitly say, like, hey, how come you don't look 10 years older? to one of our time traveling protagonists. And then she says the line, "You never die, and you always want something," which is pretty much a description of what a Terminator is. A Terminator can die, but it's very hard for them to die. And their sole purpose for existing is that they want one thing. So has Sarah become a Terminator?
I mean, we have seen elements of this both in Terminator 2, the movie, obviously, but also in the first two episodes with Sarah seeing her only purpose to make sure John survives and has the skills he needs. And considering most other people dead, they just don't know it. This is a huge part of Sarah's character for the entire series, that she is a Terminator. And whether or not she can grow from that, or if she's stuck both by time travel and by the trauma of what happened to her in the first movie, I think is an open question. I think it's Josh. Shoot, what's his name? The showrunner of the show, in one of the commentaries on the episode, says that Sarah's problem is she loves everyone, and everyone she loves dies. And I think that's what sets her apart in some ways from Terminators, because Terminators very rarely develop any connection to another person or even machine that could be described as even close to love. And this show is about at least two Terminators who do that, or maybe do that. But the parallels, I mean, you've drawn out some parallels, and we're going to draw out some more in this episode, really just emphasize the questions of, if Sarah is a Terminator and a hero, because she is often heroic, what does that mean for being a hero? What does that mean for us who are watching, who want to emulate Sarah in some ways? What can we learn from Sarah? What can we avoid from Sarah's actions and attitude?
Yeah, well, it goes to sort of the Nietzsche quote that I mentioned in the opening monologue. That those who hunt monsters should take care that they not become monsters. You mentioned Christopher Nolan. Of course, the famous line from The Dark Knight is, "If you don't die a hero, you live long enough to become the villain." And yeah, there is this theme that runs throughout the show of Sarah being a kind of anti-hero. Maybe not necessarily a villain, but a kind of anti-hero because of her relentless pursuit of this goal despite any other intervening possible goods.
Sarah says something that I think helps, in my opinion, highlight why she is not fully a Terminator. And that is when Teresa says, "Don't let him die in vain." Sarah says, "Nobody dies in vain." And in some sense, I think she's wrong, because you could argue that many people in the Terminator series, both the movies and the books and the this TV series that we're watching now, do die in vain, in that what their deaths are supposed to accomplish doesn't accomplish it. So
Well, sorry.
Miles dies theoretically to stop Skynet from existing. You could say that in the world of Terminator 2, that one movie, that is true. Obviously, anything that takes place after that takes for granted the idea that no, Judgment Day still happens. It is only delayed. So does Miles die in vain? No, he doesn't. He gives Sarah and John a chance to live. And more, he is heroic. He's inspirational in his death. And I think that what Sarah means when she says nobody dies in vain is that everyone's life is valuable, as you say, the image of God. That is why human life is valuable. And Sarah, even though her own spiritual questions and belief structure is very undefined throughout the series, I think purposefully so, she knows instinctively that the goal is to save as many people as possible because of that value of that life. And yet, when people die, it is something to mourn. And if you can hold on to that mourning, you hold on to your humanity.
Well, and that's why, I mean, I began with the Normandy landing, not just because today's D-Day Memorial Day, but also because it kind of ties into that theme, which is that 1/4 of the men who landed on the beaches in Normandy died on that beach. And so you
And
could say,
most of
okay,
them in the first few minutes.
yeah, so you could say, well, what was the point of them being there in the first place? And it's, well, so that the other 3/4,
So the next guys wouldn't die.
correct. I think it also ties into the theme that kind of runs through this series and becomes more apparent in season 2, which is that changing the past affects the future. And so Miles Dyson's Skynet doesn't exist. And Skynet is invented by someone else, and that changes the nature of what Skynet becomes. And like I said, that becomes more apparent in season 2.
Yeah, and that changing and what I said about robots being able to love or experience a connection that we could plausibly argue is at least close to love is something unique. Well, not completely unique, but because it's a TV show, it's able to be developed much more deeply and I think powerfully and satisfyingly than the movies just hint at. The movies do tend to have a very simplistic robots evil, humans good, with occasional complexities like Arnold and T2 and T3 being good, but they're kind of black and white or gray and black morality. There's not a lot of nuance on the machine side, but this show gives the machines a lot of nuance, and I love it.
Yeah, so that moves us on to our next scene, in which Sarah sort of gets the information from Teresa that a intern working for Miles Dyson might be a possible suspect. Andy Good. Andrew means man, and so the character Andy Good, his name literally means good man. And so she goes to check him out. She's driving in a Jeep and wearing this biker chick outfit, which is sort of her soldier outfit.
Yeah, I would say that especially the leather jacket functions as battle armor for Sarah. It's a visual signifier that always indicates that she is in a shell and ready to do battle.
It reminded me of one of our other favorite science fiction shows, that also came out in 2008, Fringe, in which the main character
Whereas black and gray.
only wears black and gray, and this is pointed out to her in a sort of very meaningful scene. I forget whether it's towards the end of season 2 or the beginning of season 3. But up until that point, Olivia Dunham is sort of an unwitting soldier, whereas Sarah knows that she's a soldier from the very beginning of this series. So I think that's interesting. I also think that it's interesting that she's driving a Jeep, which is the same vehicle that she drove in the movies, even though
the end of Terminator 1 is when she
the
started
end of
driving it.
Terminator 1, even though that is not the least conspicuous vehicle that she could be driving. I mean, if she was really being, a good spy, she would be driving like a Toyota Camry or something.
Honda Civic.
Yeah.
Something super boring.
But a Jeep is a military vehicle, and so it's also part of her outfit.
Again, a visual signifier. It's a clue to what we're supposed to think and feel about Sarah as a person and what she represents.
So then we have these parallel scenes where she sort of does this meet cute with Andy Good.
There's a very rom-com vibe about them. I thought that was enjoyable.
Yeah, well, she's intentionally attempting to seduce him.
But she's also really cute, and he's very cute too.
They are attractive Hollywood people, yes. You told me last episode that you didn't want me to talk about that aspect of it, so I was avoiding it, but yes.
I did? What did I say?
That I wasn't allowed to talk about how attractive Lena Headey is.
She is very attractive.
Okay. Moving on. So she tells him that he's not a very good salesman, which he's not. And he says, I guess I'm not very good at selling myself. I think that there's something immoral about that. And then, again, excellent writing. Very good writing. Who did you say the writer of this episode was again?
This is John Worth.
John Worth. We transition to a scene in which a scientist sells himself, which I think makes him evil. You're less ambiguous. So it begins with it's the actor Adam Godley, who usually kind of plays sniveling English maybe bad guy is a strong term, but not good people. And he's talking on the phone. He says, we have to stay ahead of the Germans. Again, recalling the opening scene with the Los Alamos scientists. And then he makes this very ignoble claim. He says, they never give the money to the guys on the cutting edge. So greed is and the desire for credit and fame and glory is sort of the establishing motivation of this scientist.
He clearly is arrogant and competitive in a kind of unpleasant way. There's a lot of shorthand that I will agree is supposed to place him negatively, but I think he is just as much caught up in something bigger than himself that he doesn't intend, which makes it hard for me to describe him as evil per se. I think he's negative but not evil. Even though the first time I ever encountered Adam Godley as an actor, he was voicing Jesus of Nazareth in a radio drama about the life of Christ.
Well, sure. And so then we cut to Sarah reporting back to John and Cameron in their sort of kitchen cabinet scene. And Cameron and John are sort of immediately go to, okay, well, we got to kill this guy. Sarah is taking the more compassionate stance of saying we don't know whether he's actually going to invent Skynet or not, and so it would be immoral to kill him. It's kind of this. It's the and I think we'll probably return to this theme throughout the series. it's kind of the Minority Report dilemma of whether you can prosecute somebody for a crime they haven't committed yet.
Well, I have two questions about this sort of kitchen briefing. Do you feel that Sarah, how much does Sarah actually like Andy as a person and maybe even romantically? Because there are those vibes, and also I think she does genuinely think he's someone she likes, even if she's not interested in him romantically.
Well, I think I was going to talk about this when we get to the next scene with Andy Good, but since you bring it up now, so in the discussion with Teresa Good, Teresa says that Miles' son has sort of become estranged from her, and Sarah says that she wishes that was different. And then in the next scene with Andy, we find out that Andy quit school at Caltech because his mom was sick and he wanted to help his mom, which makes Andy Good sort of a parallel to John Connor, that he's the faithful son, as opposed to Miles Dyson's son, who's become estranged from his mother.
It's really interesting how Andy Good is really liked or even beloved by multiple characters, and yet all the characters who love him screw him over really badly.
It's a corny, it's a somewhat corny nomenclature, but yeah, he's a good man.
Well, the other thing I wanted to raise about this kitchen briefing is this is explicitly reversing Terminator 2, where Sarah wants to execute Miles without any questions or even talking to him. She wants to snipe him. And John has to persuade her not to do that. And in here, John and Cameron are like, kill Andy. And Sarah's like, do you feel like this is deliberate character growth on Sarah's part through the writers? Or do you think it's just her personal connection with Andy from that meeting?
I mean, it's somewhat arbitrary in that at the end of the episode, it's John who's put back into the position of being the compassionate one, and Cameron and Sarah who are being the ruthless ones.
Sarah is still being more compassionate.
There is a sense in which that is true. I think it's kind of sticking with the theme that we developed at the very beginning of the episode of her wanting to understand why a scientist would want to do what the scientists at Los Alamos were doing, why Andy is doing what he did, why Miles Dyson did what he did. One of our other favorite films is the Miyazaki film The Wind Also Rises, which that's the dominant theme of that movie as well, is not a scientist but an engineer who creates a weapon of mass destruction.
A weapon of surpassing artistry and impeccable design and great beauty that was used by an evil empire to wage a war that brought destruction upon his people.
Correct. And so I think it's clear in this episode that Andy, in creating the Turk, has good intentions, even you may say loving intentions. Love towards other people, love and towards the machine itself. But that the Turk may ultimately be the seed of humanity's destruction. And Sarah wants to understand that.
And we also have a very interesting note that closes out this kitchen briefing, which is that Cameron says, "Fooled you again," after Sarah tells her that she shouldn't kill anyone and tries to get John to order her not to kill anyone unless Sarah approves.
Yeah, so one thing we haven't talked about is one of the sort of sub themes in this episode is the idea that Cameron is supposed to be in disguise. She's supposed to be pretending to be an ordinary teenager, but that she's not very good at it. Which through most of the episode is played for comic effect. This is a present for you. It's tight. And so I think what she means by "fooled you again" is calling back to an earlier scene where John's admonishing her on acting like a normal teenager and not like a freak. And Cameron says, "Well, I fooled you once already," referring to the first scene with her in episode 1, in which she does come off as a normal teenager for the purpose of fooling John. And so this is Cameron reminding John that she is in fact not a normal teenager, but is in fact a killing machine. So yeah, so that ends with a sort of a that line sort of is a stinger that leads to an obvious commercial break, because this was originally a television show. Then we open up with the Faustian biochemist, who I think is evil, and you apparently feel more like Sarah does about Andy Good.
I wouldn't say that. I just think that compared to some actual monsters we see, or even the rat from last episode, he feels more a victim of circumstance than an active malefactor.
No, he could have said no, Ian. He could have said,
And just
"No, I
been
will
dead.
not
Yes.
do that."
Okay.
Cromartie would have killed him, and then Cromartie would have had to have found some other scientists to do his evil bidding.
Yeah, I'm not convinced.
Okay. So Cromartie shows up with the formula that this guy so desperately wants in order to defeat his scientific rivals. He says, this is impossible. This would never work. He, reviews the formula and realizes that not only is this a superior solution to the scientific problem of rapid skin growth that he's apparently working on, superior to his rivals' theories, but also superior to his own. And Cromartie says, make this for me. And he agrees, and he says, we'll need a lot of blood. And Cromartie says, I brought my own. Then cut to, and again, excellent writing, Ian. This is a very well written episode. We cut to Sarah in a bathtub shaving her legs. And
I wanted to comment on something that I forgot to comment on earlier, which is this episode is still what we'd call early Fox TV show episode, because we have Cameron walking in her underwear through the house and Sarah in the bathtub. So some perhaps unnecessary.
I think I'm about to make an argument that the purpose of Sarah being in a bathtub shaving her legs is not salaciousness.
I think
But it's
salaciousness is included in the purpose.
okay. Well, so while she's shaving her legs to get ready for her date with Andy Good, she's contemplating the real life situation of Mo Berg, who was an American baseball player who also worked as a spy for the U.S. Army, who was sent to Germany. It's an amazing story. There's actually a documentary that came out a year or so ago about Mo Berg. That's quite good. But he was sent to Germany to attend a lecture by Werner Heisenberg, the German scientist who was in charge of the Nazi uh, atomic bomb project, to determine how far along Heisenberg was and what his chances of success in building an atomic bomb were, and that if Berg determined that Heisenberg was capable of building an atomic bomb, that he was to assassinate Heisenberg, which is a situation that's parallel to the situation that Sarah's in. And so at the end of the scene, she cuts herself while shaving, and a drop of blood dissipates in the bath water that she's in. Again, paralleling the actions of the Terminator, reinforcing the question, has Sarah become the monster that she's hunting? So she puts herself into a different disguise. She's now wearing a hippie chick peasant blouse, and she goes on this date with Andy Good. The date seems to be going well. Andy shares more about his life. He asked her an interesting question, which is, did you ever want to be anything other than a waitress? And what was it? And she says, I can't remember. Again, reinforcing the idea that she's become, in some sense, less human since the events of the first movie. That she no longer has normal human hopes and dreams, that she's just obsessed with a singular goal. Ian has Ian thinking face on.
It's more feeling. Sarah is such an intensely sympathetic figure in a lot of ways if you're willing to put yourself in her shoes. From the outside, she's cold and ruthless and not a lot of fun to be around because she hurts people. Although there's a lot of complexity in that we get into when we introduce the character of Derek Reese. But Sarah is hard and cold. But she's hard and cold for reasons that we understand because we've seen her go from a carefree, thoughtless girl to a woman who feels like she's walking in a graveyard and who never asked for any of it. And you do really wonder, what would Sarah have become? Would she have just sort of kept taking college courses, but never maybe really earning a degree, never really becoming anything, certainly never owning a cafe of her own and having her own waitresses work for her? It feels like she would kind of drift through life.
Yeah, I thought about that too with that line. I'm like, yeah, I mean, if you try to imagine the trajectory that Sarah was on before the Terminator shows up in the first movie, she's essentially a sort of a frivolous person. You know,
Yes.
she is making just enough money to survive.
Well, and take
Uh,
college courses.
she's, seems to be mostly interested in sort of being a party girl and having fun.
For sure.
And yeah, it seems like if we were to just imagine what Sarah would have become were it not for this quirk of fate, she would have probably have stayed a frivolous waitress. It's interesting now because in the present circumstance, waitress is also a kind of disguise. Sarah is not a waitress. She's pretending to be a waitress for the purposes of destroying Skynet. So it's
protecting her
also
son.
part of her costume.
Yeah. And I think it's important to remember that she's decided to kill Skynet because she wants to stay connected with her son, and her son was no longer content to run with her. Her son forced her to turn and fight, even though she was relatively content just continuing to run. And I think that indicates that her motivation is ultimately still the love of her son.
When again, imagining an alternate future for Sarah, would she have even ever become a mother? If the Sarah that we meet at the beginning of the first movie hadn't been hunted by the Terminator, would she have even become a mother?
I think she might have, but I don't think that she would have. I don't know. I just this maybe seems mean, but I just don't think the Sarah at the beginning of Terminator 1 is a particularly admirable or interesting person. She's not a bad person. She's just, as you say, frivolous and not really headed anywhere. As are many of us, which I think is why people find her journey compelling and tragic and powerful.
Well, it is poignant and tragic in that the thing that her life didn't have very much meaning prior to the events of the first movie. Her life has a meaning now, but it's an ultimately tragic one. Because it involves death and pain and probable failure. So then we get this other parallel. Like I said, there's this weird parallel between Sarah and Cromartie in this episode, and there's this parallel between Andy and the you don't like the term evil, I'll use the term Faustian, the Faustian biochemist, and Andy has a secret in behind a door, and he there's a monster hiding behind that door, and he's willing, because he's ultimately a good and loving person, he's willing to show Sarah what the secret is behind the door. So we learned that he's building this artificial intelligence that can play chess. We have the ominous chess poster of a human hand playing against a Terminator claw playing chess. Again, shadows of the plot developments of season 2. This idea of this cosmic chess match between a human and a machine. And he reveals that he is building this Turk. So he explains that the Turk is named after a automaton from the 18th century that played chess. What he doesn't mention, and I thought this was interesting. I don't know whether the writers intended this or not, but I think it's an interesting parallel to the themes of this episode. The Turk from the 18th century, the 1700s, was a fraud. It wasn't a real machine that played chess. It was a puppet, and inside the puppet was a dwarf that controlled the mechanical hands that played chess. And so you have this idea that inside the machine is a human who's ultimately responsible for the machine's actions. So just like I said, I don't know whether that was the intention of the writer. Andy doesn't mention that part, but if you know the history of the Turk and the history of chess, I thought that was an interesting parallel. So again, Sarah reports back to John. She says, it's just a chess playing robot, you know. And John's like, no, we got to kill it. And so John lays out the sort of the nightmare scenario. So she says it plays chess. John says, so did Einstein. And then he has this brief monologue in which he explains the concept of the singularity, a concept that I think is most associated with the writer Ray Kurzweil, but I think in some sense has its origins way back in Asimov, if not before. The idea that at a certain point, intelligent machines would be able to construct machines that are more intelligent than themselves, and eventually supplant humanity.
The difference is Asimov thought it would be great.
Well, I think, when Kurzweil originally published his book, I think Kurzweil also thought it would be great because he saw it as a harbinger of a transhuman future for the human species. I think Kurzweil has become slightly more pessimistic in the intervening years. Check back on that. I need to do some research on Ray Kurzweil. And so the episode ends with him saying, you have to stop it like you said that you would. So there's this idea that Sarah has promised to do something that she needs to carry through on her promise.
And I think that's key because it's, again, reminding us that Sarah's doing this because she loves John.
Correct. So then we cut back to Ellison, faithful James Ellison, just doing normal FBI agent crime fighting.
And we have his red-headed FBI friend lady who becomes a very important character in this season.
Yes. Kind of a jerk to Ellison in this episode. Maybe playfully.
Definitely some professional rivalry.
But a jerk nonetheless. So she reveals that the fingerprints found at the what we know to be the resistance cell safe house, the fingerprints found were from a 4-year-old from Canton, Ohio, proving therefore that this is an entirely frivolous investigation. Ellison is not so sure for reasons that he can't fully articulate. Of course, we know that the reason that the fingerprints belong to a 4-year-old is that that 4-year-old will grow up in a post-apocalyptic nuclear waste future, which is sort of there's this concept from the TV Tropes website of fridge logic. So you kind of have to work that out in your own mind. It's not explicitly stated in the episode. The idea that, yeah, this poor little 4-year-old boy in just a few years is going to become a a slave to robots in some concentration camp somewhere. Which again, I think reinforces, if you sort of work through that bit of fridge logic, reinforces the stakes for the project that John and Sarah and Cameron are engaged in. That they're trying to prevent a 4-year-old boy from becoming a slave in a concentration camp in a post-nuclear war future. It's revealed that the blood found at the crime scene doesn't contain red blood cells, which both literally and thematically means that it's not human blood, because humans are red-blooded.
Now, does it make any sense? Maybe.
Okay, well, humans have red blood, so in all science fiction shows, if the blood isn't red, then it means they're not human.
No, I'm saying, does it make sense that Terminators have human blood that doesn't have red blood cells?
You know, all unexplained. I'll create a parallel to
Arthur C. Clarke?
Clarke's Law, which is that all unexplained technology in science fiction movies is effectively magic. Like if there's no explanation for how the technology works, then it is in fact effectively magic. Which applies the next scene doubles down on the premise of the stinger for the end of the Ellison scene, in which I don't think there's any conceivable way in which how the Terminator grows skin again could happen in real life. It's clearly a sorcerous occult like satanic magic ritual. I mean, the Cromartie literally bathes himself in human blood in order to grow this skin back. Which is something straight out of like a medieval story about witches.
Madame Bathory.
Yeah, and vampires, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the next scene, again, I say evil, you say conflicted. The scientist goes behind a closed door, just like Andy Good, to reveal the monster, and who bathes in human blood in order to disguise himself as a human. And the last words we hear from the scientist are, "Who are you? What are you?"
Evil time traveling robots.
Yes. Which again, you know, like we talked about last episode, all literature asks the question, who am I? Who is Cromartie?
That question
Then we
becomes
have
much more complex and interesting in season 2.
yes, a question that becomes more interesting. So then we have the sort of conclusion of the high school subplot in this episode, which, as we already discussed, is quite shocking. The only thing I didn't mention, I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into this. You could tell me now. So the reason that the girl kills herself is because there are these paintings that have been painted on the wall, literally silhouettes or shadows that have been painted on the wall of apparently her having an illicit affair with a teacher at the school. Again, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but one of the most macabre elements of the story of the atomic bomb is that in the ruins of Hiroshima, it was discovered that the flash of the explosion was so bright that it burned images of the shadows of the victims onto the walls of some of the buildings in Hiroshima. I'm not saying that's what the writers intended, but I thought it was an interesting parallel that occurred in my mind. The idea of silhouettes on the wall.
That feels a little far to me, but
Cut back to Sarah and Andy hiking in some sort of bamboo forest. I'm not sure where that's supposed to be in Los Angeles. I'm sure it's a real place. I just don't know where it is. And she's wearing a different costume in this scene. She's wearing the jungle gorilla outfit, hiking outfit. Andy is wearing shorts, which kind of makes him look slightly doofy, in my opinion. Doofy and childlike, perhaps. And she has a gun, so she's possibly going to kill him. But she does not. And it turns out that instead, either she or the resistance fighters, it's made to be somewhat ambiguous, burn his house down. We have a scene again in the kitchen with John Cameron and Sarah, in which he says, "Aren't I supposed to be? Am I not supposed to be a hero?" And then he, in very eye-rollingly dismissive teenage sort of way, says, "Why not give it to them if we're going to act like them?" Which puts a button on the whole
is Sarah a Terminator plot?
yes. And then we have a scene, poor James Ellison just doing his... Oh, Ian has further thoughts on that.
Well, I'm just thinking about the trajectory where we go from here. And does John... I mean, a big question that just is such a huge part of John's arc is Sarah, we already know, has become very Terminator-like. But John is still very kind of typical of teen kids. But can a typical teen boy beat Robot Satan, aka Skynet?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the episode seems to want to draw some parallels between Andy Good and John. It's sort of like this informed... It's never explicitly brought out, but it's sort of this informed idea that John is somehow, in his spare time, become a brilliant computer scientist, or is becoming a brilliant computer scientist. He makes the joke at the beginning of the episode, she's saying, well, what did you do today in school? And he said, we learned stuff. I'm like, did you? Like, every scene we ever see of John in high school, it looks like he's not doing any schoolwork at all. So
Which is why I think it's
how he
good.
becomes a brilliant computer scientist who's able to reprogram Terminators in the future, we have no idea.
Which is why I think it's good they dropped the school stuff, because it was silly.
But it kind of goes to what you brought up, possibly watching the new anime show Terminator Zero at the beginning of the episode. One of the things that was interesting in reading the short article about it that you sent me was that the creators explicitly wanted to sort of ditch the Connor aspect of the Terminator franchise and just focus on the Terminators. And one of the questions I had reading that was like, does the Terminator story work without John Connor and Sarah Connor?
Well, we will definitely.
Or is it does it just become a generic evil robot story?
We will get to answer that question when we get to Terminator Dark Fate. And I think when we get to both Genesis and Terminator 3 and Salvation, we'll find out that the people who create the Terminator franchise have been trying to get rid of John Connor since Terminator 3. And so that'll be...
And I was listening to something, I forget what it was. I was listening to something the other day where they were talking about how as a culture, we've lost the ability to tell stories about heroes. Maybe this circles back to how I began the episode talking about the soldiers who fought at Normandy. Part of what I would say is sort of the decadence of our current culture is that we no longer appreciate stories about heroes.
It's because a hero is someone who has power to enforce his desires, enforce his will. And we've focused our ethical discussions completely on questions of agency and power differential, to the point where we no longer understand that it is more important to figure out what is right than to figure out who has more power.
It was the debate between Terry Eagleton and Roger Scruton that I sent you. That's where it came from. Roger Scruton says that as a criticism of Marxist critical theory in literature.
Which is exactly where I believe that this obsession with who has more power rather than who is right comes from.
So that begs the question, is John Connor a hero?
He certainly is not one yet. He has impulses in wanting to save this girl, but he does not have the ability to save her yet.
Because like we said at the beginning, part of the story arc for Sarah in the first movie is that she transforms from being, because of the bravery of Kyle Reese in the first movie, she herself transforms from being a hapless victim to a hero of sorts.
Maybe.
Well, that's what the rest of the franchise is about, is whether she is truly a hero or not. She is presented as being a hero at the end of the first movie for destroying this monster.
I feel she's presented as being a survivor at the end of the first movie. Going back to the horror roots. She is the final girl. The final girl is often not a hero; they're a survivor.
Well, so it's complicated. She destroys the monster that is trying to kill her uh, in that story. It's clear at the ending of that movie when she says there's a storm coming that the evil has not been completely destroyed. Which again sort of plays into the slasher genre trope of the final girl. That the final girl survives the attack of the slasher, but is unable to completely destroy the monster. So yeah, it's this weird because what makes the Terminator franchise interesting as an iteration of the slasher genre is that you can destroy individual Terminators, but destroying Skynet is a lot harder. Which is an interesting twist on the idea of the monster in slasher movies. So we have this final scene in which poor Andy Good, his house burns down. And she concludes where we began, reflecting on the Los Alamos scientist in the Manhattan Project. She quotes from Oppenheimer. Oh, first of all, so we have a scene where Ellison discusses the further investigation. Cromartie steals the Faustian scientist's eyeballs,
which doesn't make any sense to me. How does a robot use eyes, and how would those eyes not immediately start rotting?
Again, any unexplained technology is functionally magic.
I don't
and
like that.
And it's meant to be thematic, first of all, because the scientist is turning a blind eye to the obviously evil intentions of Cromartie. And so stealing his eyes is an appropriate poetic punishment for that.
I mean, I don't disagree about the thematic and symbolic elements. I just think that it doesn't make any sense because that's not how robot eyes work.
And then again, very well written show. It parallels to Sarah in the next scene talking about how the flash of the Trinity test was so bright that a blind girl was able to see it from several miles away. And then she gives the famous quote from Robert Oppenheimer, the leader of the Manhattan Project, when he quoted from the Bhagavad Gita saying, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." One interesting thing I learned, again, I personally, along with Sarah, have been obsessed with the Manhattan Project for the past few years and read several books on it. One thing I learned from Ray Monk's biography of Oppenheimer, which I think is superior to the Kai Bird biography, is that passage from the Bhagavad Gita is not typically translated that way. It's typically translated, "I have become time," or the future. I don't think the writers of the show probably knew that, but again, it's this interesting idea that thematically keeps coming up in the Terminator franchise, that it's the future that, in an abstract sense, that is trying to destroy the Connors. So Oppenheimer, I have become death, the destroyer of worlds. To which another scientist, Kenneth Bainbridge's response to Oppenheimer was saying, "We're all sons of bitches now. We have become the monsters that we wish to destroy."
And again, another hammering home of that point of Sarah has more in common with Terminators than she does with humans in many ways. But I think it is crucial to note that Sarah refuses to kill Andy, and instead, even though it is cold and heartbreaking for Andy, she does it to preserve his life.
She does. She does it to preserve his life. Again, there's the parallel between Moberg and Werner Heisenberg, in which Moberg did not, in fact, assassinate Werner Heisenberg. Werner Heisenberg was not successful in creating an atomic bomb for Germany, and survived the war, lived a somewhat tragic life afterwards, continually sort of having to explain himself and why he chose to work for the Nazis, and why he was unsuccessful in creating an atomic bomb. And yeah, so there's this whole mythology behind Werner Heisenberg that's perhaps being referenced there. Yeah, I this is an excellent episode, Ian. There's just no other way of putting it.
It is good. I think all the episodes we've watched so far, all three, have been good, but this is not a worse episode.
And I think we'll probably return to this theme of, in the way that I framed it at the beginning, of responsibility. How do you determine who is responsible when something tragic and evil happens?
And I think it's an interesting point to make that John's arc in this show is very much a dark version of, the classic coming of age of a young man. You could see him as a dark parallel to Spider-Man, who gains great power and is able to do great things and ultimately even get the girl, even though it's sometimes a hard soap opera-y path to that. Whereas John is set on this path and he's given knowledge that gives him great potential power, and whether or not he uses that power to become more powerful himself, it doesn't matter what he does. His power is contingent upon horror. The world must be destroyed for his life to really matter in the way that he's been told his whole life that he matters.
Yeah, which is, again, often, we'll probably discuss this at some future episode. The Terminator franchise has deep roots in the history of literary science fiction. And that's also a dominant theme and question at the heart of the Dune books, which has been, in my opinion, somewhat unsuccessfully brought out in the recent films, in part because of what we just discussed, which is that we have problems telling stories about heroes, without making it about power differentials.
Because I think that for a hero to be heroic, he has to stand for something bigger than himself. And in our current moment, we don't believe in things bigger than ourselves.
Yeah. So in the books, I think this is the fairly standard interpretation. In the books, Paul Atreides and his son Leto II are heroes, but a tragic sort of hero because of what you just said, that their fate is tied with what in the books is called terrible purpose, that causes mass death and destruction. So yeah, interesting parallel there.
Yeah, the lead into this project, this podcast, had me really thinking about heroism and how, especially in Terminator, it's really brought out how a hero is parallel to Christ. I mean, John Connor, JC, is explicitly a Christ figure, but a dark one, and one who we have to think about, what does it mean to be a hero? Um, what does salvation mean for the Connors and for humanity in a world where hell on earth happens before the return of Christ? And watching it in conjunction with Dune and some other, and of course I've always been thinking and reading Star Wars things, and of course you've got Luke Skywalker and Anakin Skywalker and that, and the various literary Christ figures and how they all interplay has really spurred some, I think, interesting ideas in my head about heroism and uh, religion and the nature of good and evil. So I am very excited to continue along with John Connor's journey and exploring those thoughts with you and with the audience.
Yeah, I mean, it is. We've produced another long episode. To fully unpack that would probably take even longer.
No, that's just, we're going to keep going. And John Connor's journey is one of the reasons I'm excited about this.
I agree that the Terminator franchise presents a more, to use the language of Protestant Christian eschatology, the Terminator franchise presents possibly a more amillennialist version of end times than a post-millennialist version. So yeah, certainly something to discuss in the future.
Well, for next time, we're going to be looking at a film instead of the next episode, which is Terminator 3, because of the question raised at the beginning of this episode of why would humans create Skynet, in the same way that Sarah asked, why would humans create the atomic bomb? And Terminator 3 is literally about that creation.
The
So,
moment before Judgment Day, and
well, the
immediately after.
day and a half.
The moment before Judgment Day and the day immediately after.
So, until next time, when we watch Terminator 3, I've been
We'll be
Ian.
back. And I'm Calvin. We'll be back.